I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside, it's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off road. The guy managed the group. He was like, "What are you doing in this beautiful car?" I'm like, "I'm going off road." He's like, "Are you sure? Because you can use one of ours." And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
Sometimes it takes a different approach to help you unlock your true potential. Capella University's game-changing FlexPath format helps you learn at your own pace and fit earning a degree into your life. From before you enroll to after you graduate, you'll be supported by people who are invested in your success so you can pursue your goals knowing that help is available if you need it. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show. Today on the James Altucher Show.
Such a smart guest, Sam Harris. One of the smartest guests I've had on. This is his third time on, and we were talking about his book, Making Sense, Conversations on Consciousness, Morality, and the Future of Humanity. And we touched on all of those topics, both the good, the bad, and the ugly of society's morality, our views on consciousness, and the future of humanity, where we're going both culturally and scientifically. But to start off this podcast, I knew Sam is a smart guy, and I wanted to ask him for a bit of advice. I was going through something that day, and he helped me out. And here's the podcast. So I have, once again, Sam Harris on the podcast. He just wrote a new book called Making Sense, and it's basically his best conversations from his podcast, which are completely fascinating, and many of these conversations have blown my mind. But also, Sam, first off, congratulations on putting the book out.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Happy to be here, James. Nice to talk to you again.
I was amazed, too, by the accolades on the back. You have Ricky Gervais, Andrew Yang, Richard Dawkins, Bill Maher. How'd you get all these people to say how great this book is?
Well, actually, so the book is, as you said, a based on the podcast conversations, which we then transformed a little bit. I mean, I improved my side of the conversation, and the guest improved theirs, and it really becomes the final version of these exchanges, and we each got a chance to take our feet out of our mouths and just sharpen things up. But the people who blurbed the book were essentially blurbing the podcast. I mean, many of them, I think possibly all of them, have been on the podcast. So, Ricky Gervais and Bill Maher, they've been guests on the podcast, so they know what they're talking about.
And, you deal with so many interesting topics. Like in this book, you talk about everything from consciousness to morality to racism to cognitive biases to the idea that we might be in a simulation. And even that particular discussion, which in some ways is a wacky kind of conversation, you guys really connect the dots in such an interesting way that it it seems like almost a normal thing to consider. Hey, not only are we probably in a simulation, but this is how it makes sense, and it's not even that big a deal that we're in a simulation. And I found many of the conversations that way, that you would take these esoteric topics and bring it back to earth in some way. But I want to kind of, well, actually, I want to start off on a tangent and ask you a semi-personal question.
Sure.
I've seen, throughout the years, you've written all these books. Like, you wrote a book on Islam, you've written a book on, on lying, you've written a book on free will. And throughout the years, whether it's the podcast or the books, you've gotten a lot of hate occasionally. And just today in particular, I happen to be the focus of a lot of hate for some reason.
Oh, yeah.
And
What do people hate you for today?
as opposed to yesterday.
Yeah.
So recently I wrote an article, which was just my personal view, plus it was very fact-based on, and the title was extreme. New York City is dead forever. Here's why. And I present a bunch of facts that I couldn't quite see myself through to the solution. And it's not important, all the reasons, but it was just economically, New York City is going to have rising deficits at lower than ever revenues. And these are the kind of problems cities have when that situation happens. And there's no easy solution. So I wrote this article. It got much bigger than I thought it would. And then today, Jerry Seinfeld wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, not even trashing the article, but just kind of personally trashing me throughout the entire op-ed.
That's no good. Okay, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, and
That's
he
painful.
didn't address anything in the article, just basically, was upset. And so I'm getting an enormous tidal wave of hate, death threats,
Wow.
stuff that I've gotten before, but it's a little enhanced. And I'm getting the other side as well, but of course you focus on the negative more. I'm just curious how you have dealt with that in the past.
Well, there are sort of two levels of dealing with it. One is emotionally, and the other is just practically. Practically speaking, the easy part, I take security seriously. I don't advertise where I live. When I have a public event, which under COVID that doesn't happen, but in the normal course of things, if I do a public event, I take security seriously, and it just comes with the territory. I have touched controversial issues, and I've touched even just issues that are not especially polarizing, but which attract their fair share of lunatic interest, right? So you don't know whether the person who poses a threat to you is ideological or just crazy, but both are a problem. So I've taken practical steps to be as careful and secure as possible there, and then I just more or less forget about that problem. That's easy enough to do, provided you've taken the practical steps, the prudent steps you should. But then there's this emotional component, which I find is easier and easier to deal with, and becomes a non-issue as long as you are clear that your intentions are good, which is to say, what you're putting out there is coming from a place of actually wanting a better world, right? You actually care about people. You want society to function well. You're not a morbidly selfish or narcissistic person. I mean, you care about the right things, right? So you're actually, it's coming from a good place, even if some people are finding what you're saying offensive or otherwise inflammatory. And then there's just the question of whether you're actually reasoning honestly, right? So whether you're putting in the work to be, coherent and not obviously misled by confirmation bias or wishful thinking or some other cognitive error. And as long as you're doing those two things, which you want to do anyway, even if you have no public platform, and you're just trying to reason your way through life and figure out how to live a good life, and not bump into hard objects all the time, you want to be reasoning carefully, and you want to be well-intentioned with respect to other people. I mean, you'd rather love people and have them love you than hate people and have them hate you, right? So putting your house in order uh, to whatever degree you can and should, again, this is a project that awaits anyone, whether they are on social media or not, or whether they're publishing anything publicly or not. That solves the problem of really being blown around by how things are received, right? Because it just in the case where you put something out there which was born of actual bad intentions, right? Where you were being a jerk, you were treating someone without even a modicum of charity. You were straw manning their argument. Their argument's actually much better than you were giving it credit for, and you were just kind of maligning them. You put that out there, and then you get blowback. Well, then you feel shitty, and you should feel shitty, right? I mean, you're being sloppy. You're spreading toxic waste in our information space, and you shouldn't do that. And Twitter lets you have it, and that's fine. And the message there is stop doing that, right? But if you're being impeccable, if what you put out is honest and strives to be accurate, it's not to say that you can't make mistakes, but if you make an honest mistake, you can just apologize. There's no friction around apologizing for an honest mistake, even if it's an honest mistake one makes in the midst of an argument with someone who's reliably dishonest and malicious, right? Like I've made apologies to my enemies, to my genuine enemies. I mean, people who work hard to be my enemies, right? And it's not that it's not that I have an enemies list and I'm maintaining it, but there are people out there who get up every day, it seems, trying to figure out how to destroy my reputation, right? They post whole, podcasts derivative of my podcast, just telling people that I'm, a racist or an Islamophobe or, whatever their particular hobby horse is. And they will, lie about things I've published, and they'll even circulate audio from my podcast which has been edited to make it sound like I'm saying the opposite of what, in fact, I was saying in context. And they'll promulgate that to their audiences. So there are real malicious assholes out there. But if I get something wrong about what they believe, I'll apologize for it, right? As long as I'm playing by the rules that I would want others to play by, I can sleep totally peacefully at night, even when things are lighting up against me, because I know what is lighting up is based on ignorance or confusion or bias or some other derangement of other people, which I, in the end, am not responsible for. And you can't control the outcome, in that space. You can really only control the kinds of intentions you act on and how you act.
I guess, it's interesting because, so I, of course, live in New York City. I have 5 kids. Several go to school still in New York City. I own a storefront business in New York City. So the future of this major city that I've was born in, lived around all my life is very important to me. And so, although who knows, as you mentioned, there's cognitive biases in almost everything we do. I do think I've researched the facts. Everything is more or less sourced, or at least I know the sources. And I'm just surprised at the personal vitriol against me when I straight out say that I love New York City in the article, but here are some real problems. And then I also see it becomes this virtual signaling thing where many people who I know all of a sudden jump on the bandwagon against, because this is an opportunity for them to do so safely. And I don't know, it's just, I feel flustered by the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And you might have been, I don't know what kind of fan of Jerry Seinfeld you were, but it's
Yeah, I'm a fan of Jerry Seinfeld as well. I own a comedy club.
Right, yeah, right. So it's always annoying when somebody who you greatly admire takes the wrong end of something and seems not to admire you as a result. I haven't seen this. I didn't see your article. I haven't seen the pushback, but I will look with interest. But I know what it's like to have someone you really do admire decide based on something they've read, in this case about me, that that I'm a jerk or evil, and it's just annoying because it's very difficult to clean up that mess, and sometimes you can't. I mean, sometimes you just discover in someone you admire they're truly blockheaded on whatever topic, and this is the encounter I had with Batman on Real Time. It's like I admired Ben Affleck as an actor and a director, and I would have much preferred to meet him and have a totally happy encounter of mutual admiration. But what I got was him essentially calling me racist on television, and the blowback from that was pretty ferocious and annoying. And it didn't get any better in the green room afterwards. It was we are not friends as a result of that encounter, and that's just the way it goes.
And what did you like the day afterwards? Because I've seen that video of you and Ben Affleck. Like the day afterwards, what was sort of the blowback from that video?
Well, there was it at that point made me more visible in the Muslim community. I mean, so this was in response to my at that point, I think I still was working on this book with Majid Nawaz, Islam and the Future of Tolerance. And if anyone reads that book, you will see that this is by no means an expression of animus against Muslims as people, much less people who come from Middle Eastern countries. I mean, this is a discussion of the consequences of specific ideas, like the idea of martyrdom, the idea of jihad, the idea of apostasy or blasphemy being a killing offense. And this is something I debated with Majid Nawaz, who was once a Muslim extremist, not a terrorist, not a proper jihadist, but the next best thing, a proper Islamist who was trying to figure out how to get a theocratic regime installed in places like Pakistan. He was put in prison in Egypt for 4 years for his troubles. And anyway, he's now since an utterly rational, secular, well-intentioned, cosmopolitan person, having undergone various transformations in his outlook. And so we had a debate / conversation, both in public, in various, live events, but also we did it in the form of a book. And that's the kind of thing I was focused on then when Ben Affleck, ambushed me. I mean, ironically, the book I was then talking about on Real Time had to do with meditation and the nature of consciousness, and had nothing to do with Islam or religious conflict. But our conversation got sidetracked because clearly someone in his orbit had told him that I was a bigot for saying critical things about the wonderful religion of Islam, which we as liberals must believe is no different from any other religion, not even slightly. It has to be the same as Mormonism and Anglicanism and any other religion, and it must be a sheer accident that you see people being hunted to the ends of the earth for drawing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, or you can reliably provoke riots in a dozen countries for merely threatening to burn the Quran or even naming a teddy bear the wrong name, as happened in Nigeria. So it was at that point, and is at this, quite delusional to think that religions aren't different with different consequences. I mean, they obviously are. But on the left then, and even more so now probably, making these kinds of distinctions gets you branded as a racist, as though a set of religious ideas had anything in principle to do with any race, right? Which obviously, Islam is not a race. You can convert to it in a few minutes. You can convert away from it even faster than that. So yeah, it was the immediate result was to be put on the radar of millions and millions of very confused, very doctrinaire religious people who thought that Ben Affleck, by simply shrieking racist like an imbecile, not following any of the argument that I or Bill were making in that context, they thought he was just the white knight who rode into the defense of Muslims everywhere. And it was amazing to discover. I mean, the most depressing thing to discover in the aftermath of that, which is a lesson that many people on the far left seem to have learned indelibly at this point, is that merely calling someone racist, merely just using the word racist. I think the formulation he used, he didn't say you guys are racist. He just said it's racist in response to the things we were saying. To merely use the word convinces half of any audience that it's true. That not only has the charge been made, but somehow racism has been successfully detected. So I can't tell you how many people responded to that as though Ben had, as though he were some kind of investigative journalist, working into the wee hours of the morning, had successfully exposed our racism, right, by merely alleging that the argument we were making was racist. And it is the sheerest stupidity that allows someone to land there, and it's so dysfunctional. I mean, now it's, at the time, I think that was 2014. Now it's even more toxic, right? I mean, now social media is just absolutely poisoned by this effect, that you can just make the allegation against someone and it sticks. And we have to find some way to climb out of this, because it's making a conversation about anything of substance, whether it's the fate of a city, things like wealth inequality, police violence, epidemiology. I mean, just the most basic facts of how to respond to social and natural challenges.
Well, did you feel like the next day, you had to sort of defend your position or explain that why people were, kind of making incorrect assumptions? Because I find also that defense is a form of not quite weakness, but if you have to defend, then you're guilty, sort of thing.
Yeah, no, it's an asymmetric war, and it's very unfortunate. I mean, this is something that I've recalibrated my response to this kind of thing since. I mean, at that time, I'm sure I did defend myself at some length in various contexts. And I forget what specific form that took, but yeah, there was a lot that I felt I needed to do to try to clean up that mess. I mean, there was a lot more to be said at that point. I mean, now basically I've said everything I have to say about Islam, and so I'm the desire not to keep repeating myself is a thing that keeps a lid on it. But so I'm sort of done, and I can just kind of reference the things I've already published and said now. But then I was still kind of a work in progress there, so I just kept going. But yeah, defending yourself, the reason why it's such a thankless job is it conveys with it a message, no matter how you try to step outside of yourself and seize the moral high ground and just reason honestly, and no matter how balanced you are while doing it, it conveys the message that you are a petty and thin-skinned person who just cares about his reputation, right? You care too much about how people perceive you, and so you're stuck trying to make yourself, untarred by whatever it was that was hurled at you. And I mean, it's true. Some people care too much about their reputation, but this rests on a couple of fallacies. I mean, one is no, the truth of specific ideas really matter independent of anyone's reputation, right? So, I mean, there's just no question that it is harmful to be confused about the differences among religions or about the power of specific ideas, to take this specific case with Ben Affleck. And if there were more people in the world who believed as he did at that moment, I mean, he thought that, ISIS, couldn't fill, the people who supported ISIS at that point couldn't fill a like Yankee Stadium, or I forget the phrase he used, but, a ballpark. I mean, it was just pure leftist delusion, right? I mean, ISIS was just was at its apogee there in terms of recruiting people. People were dropping out of med school in the UK to join ISIS, right? I mean, it's just completely insane to think that this was not a captivating ideology that really mattered. So it matters to get that stuff straight, but it's also true that one's reputation is incredibly valuable, right? I mean, it's like, yes, people care about their reputations for good reason. If you are successfully smeared as a racist, right? If the first thing people see when they do a Google search on you until the end of time is that there are credible charges of racism against you, that's an awful thing to happen to you. I mean, that's every bit as bad as having someone burn down your house, right? It's probably worse, depending on what games you hope to play in your life, what sort of collaborations you hope to be able to pursue. I mean, it's awful, right? So responding to it, I mean, the problem is responding to it is still, in many cases, totally ineffectual, right? Arguing that you're not, trying to convince people that you're not a racist is a very bad place to be starting in a conversation. But it does matter when someone smears you, and it's only natural to respond, but for your own sanity, you have to pick your battles, and you have to recognize those moments when, you're just in a bad faith conversation, and you have to get out, right? There's no reason to talk to certain people because it's really not about conversation at that point. They're just smear artists, and I've learned, to cut my losses earlier now, and I attributed good faith to many people who I shouldn't have, over the years, and have paid a price. So you live and learn.
Yeah, that's definitely great advice, and segues nicely to at least 4 or 5 chapters of your book, Making Sense. You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players, and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include 2 or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So, I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy. Can you define moral relativism? Because this is related to your conversation with Ben Affleck.
Yeah, well, so it's part of this larger postmodernist notion that everything is on some level a cultural construct, right? There are no real truths that can be known or not known. It's all sort of made up by people, and
Morals, that is. I mean, many things, but in this specific case, what's good and what's bad is kind of, depends on the context, the culture, the history, and so
right.
on.
So there are people who believe this about more or less all truth claims, all knowledge claims, right? So there are people who doubt that the truths of molecular biology can stand free of culture, but it takes a lot to believe that, especially with an invisible virus raging, in every society at this moment, making people ill, and we're all awaiting a vaccine, and the fabrication of that vaccine is not going to matter. It's not going to matter whether the people doing it are white or black, or whether they're Indian or American, but even people who see the obvious errors there in general knowledge claims find it compelling that for moral claims, something like relativism must hold, right? There's just no place to stand on this account where you can say that anything is really right or wrong or good and evil, because there's so many differences of opinion here, right? So it's most people seem to think that differences of opinion can be resolved to the advantage of one or another decisively when you're talking about physics or chemistry or biology or economics even. But when you're talking about right and wrong and good and evil, when you're talking about how to live so as to maximize human well-being, or whether human well-being should even be maximized, when you're talking about values, well, then all bets are off. There's just no ground truth to be appealed to. There's no reality to be in contact with, and therefore the Taliban have just as much right to believe that they're living a good life as we do, right? And there's no place for us to stand to say, well, no, the Taliban are actually wrong about certain things with respect to morality, right? They're confused, or they're misled, and the society they hope to build is actually not as good as the society that we're struggling to build. Not as good in senses that we can enumerate and defend, and that we're making an objective claim about goodness, right? That's what's ruled out by relativism. And of course, it's been pointed out that relativism contains its own contradiction, because implicit, if not explicit, in every discussion here, the relativist is saying essentially that something follows from this view. I mean, once you admit that no one can really be right or wrong in any deep sense about good and evil, well, then this argues that tolerance is a kind of master value, right? You should be tolerating these diverse moral opinions, right? We should be tolerating the claims of jihadists who will threaten us with death if we write certain novels or publish certain cartoons. Tolerance is the master value here. But of course, that is a claim that is not relativistic, right? That is a claim that purports to be universalizable, right?
Right. So the contradiction being that they're making an absolute judgment about your judgment
Yeah, yeah.
by saying that you can't judge.
Right. Yes. Yeah, and you should be. You're wrong. You're in moral error not to be accommodating of this pluralism. Whereas that doesn't follow. It's if relativism is true, then I should be able to say, well, okay, well, fine. Then I'm just going to go kill all the jihadists, right, and count myself right here, because there is no place to stand, right? There's no place for you to resist that claim. Yeah, but relativists never do that, right? They're always arguing for a kind of uh, diversity of views that the people in their own society. I mean, the truth is it's not even philosophy. It's a political program that has vitiated academic philosophy, because I mean you can see it in just how, I mean, this is how it I mean, you can see it in the same brains of people who will be very quick to condemn any white Western person who is culpable for, the legacy of colonialism and white privilege, and anyone like me or you in a Western society who would criticize, you know in this case, the Taliban, right? I've had people condemn me for thinking that I have any insight into the experience of a woman forced to wear a burqa, right? Who am I to say that wearing a burqa is not optimal for human well-being, right? What arrogance, for me to pass judgment on this ancient culture. But these same people will be utterly outraged when they hear that, women in our society make, 81 cents on the dollar for every man, right? Like, forget about burqas, right? It absolute, not anything less than absolute parity economically is something to really be upset about. And they don't see the discordance here, right? If you care about women, if you care about equality, well, then at a minimum, you should care that, fully half of any society, in a place like Afghanistan, is being essentially threatened with disfigurement or death if they decide to live outside of a cloth sack, right?
So why do you think people can easily, and we're not just talking about idiots, these are like smart, educated, intelligent people, lawyers, doctors, PhDs.
Well, the person I reference in the book, The Moral Landscape, where I argue at great length on this topic, and the encounter I referenced there was with a woman who had a PhD in biology and a JD. She was a lawyer, so she was essentially a bioethicist, and she was on Obama's council for medical ethics. She was among 12 or 13 people who are advising the president on, the coming changes and the ethical implications of changes in genetic engineering and medicine, right? So somebody held out in our society for her moral wisdom. This is someone who castigated me at a conference for judging the ethics of the Taliban, right? And this is, forgive me for the people who've heard this, because when I was talking about The Moral Landscape, I use this anecdote a lot, but I was dumbfounded by her criticism. I said, okay, well, let me just simplify. What if we found an island of people who were removing the eyeballs of every third child? Could we then say that this is a culture that was not perfectly solving the problem of designing a moral society or optimizing human well-being? And she said, well, it would depend on why they were doing it. And I said, well, let's say they were doing it for religious reasons. Let's say they had a scripture that said every third should walk in darkness, or some such nonsense.
I like how you instantly are able to put it in very kind of biblical terms, like the walk in darkness. That takes skill.
This is my wheelhouse, for better or worse. And she said, well, then we could never say that they were wrong. Right? She's just like, full stop. It's a perfect defeater of conversation, if somebody's resort to religious faith. And this is someone who's advising the president on ethical issues. So it's mind-boggling that people get tied in knots like this, and reliably so. And so, I mean, the larger project for me is to figure out how we can have conversations that are honest enough and searching enough and, long enough, frankly. I mean, this is why the podcasting space is so important, so that we can converge on specific insights and not lose that ground again, right? I mean, we get to a place where we can actually plant a flag and say, okay, we got here by ineluctable argument, right? And we're perpetually open to new argument and new evidence. That's why free speech, it really does have to be a master norm here, because it's the only mechanism we have to correct course. It's the only way that I can discover that if I believe some dangerous bullshit and don't recognize it, the only way I can discover that is to have someone who's free to tell me, right? And at the moment we make it taboo to speak honestly about certain facts, whether it's religion in this case, or racial inequities in our society, or the topic of race itself, or wealth inequality, or climate change, or whatever it is, the moment it becomes taboo to raise specific questions or express certain doubts, the moment you're just defenestrated for not mouthing the specific pieties, there's a silencing effect, which is really dangerous, and we're witnessing that now. I mean, on specific topics, several that I just mentioned, and it's totally dysfunctional. And social media obviously is a major engine of this dysfunction.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how you solve it, because it's really hard. On the flip side, it's really hard to say also that there are moral absolutes, because morality evolves. 100 years from now, morality will be different than it is now. 20 years ago, morality was different then than it is now. But this is also related to the issues of consciousness, which are you cover quite a bit in your podcast and in this book. That to some extent, a lot of things that we can verbalize and a lot of the ways that we build our society are man-made, in fact, and are hard to judge from first principles. Like consciousness itself, we can't even really discuss in a way that is, without using consciousness to describe consciousness, as you point out in the book. So then it's hard to build kind of first principles about how humans should behave and so on after that.
Yeah, well, so morality is, in my view, derivative of consciousness, because consciousness is the only space in which things can matter, right? I mean, when you're talking about morality, you're talking about the well-being of conscious creatures. Whether you imagine you're talking about that or not. I mean, this is something that takes a while to argue for, and I do it at some length in my book, The Moral Landscape, and elsewhere. But it's just either some change in the world can affect the actual or possible experience of some conscious being somewhere, or it can't. And if it can't, I would say it doesn't matter, right? It really, like if you say you've got something in a box that is the most important thing in the universe, but it can't affect the conscious experience, actual or potential, of any being anywhere at any time, right? Well, then that's just a total non sequitur. I mean, what you have in that box is by definition the least interesting thing in the universe, right? It can't matter. So if you admit that when we talk about values, we talk about things that are worth wanting or worth fearing or worth avoiding. When we talk about the things you should do or shouldn't do because certain outcomes matter, We're talking about consciousness, again, at least implicitly, whether we're aware of it or not. And I view this as a kind of navigation problem. There's a functionally infinite set of possible experiences on offer here for minds that are appropriately constituted to have those experiences. So there's a range of possible human experiences, and we are exploring that range, however ineptly, however haphazardly. But we know that things can get better than they are now or tending to be. And we know they can get a lot worse, right? And we've seen, each of us personally and, collectively to a much greater degree, vicariously to a much greater degree, we have all seen the extremes on this spectrum of experience. We know just how bad. We know what all of us can conjure an image of something like the worst possible life. Right now, maybe things can get much worse than that in ways we can't imagine, but we can all imagine something absolutely fucking terrible, right? And we can imagine something utterly sublime, right? And that spectrum of possibility matters, if anything matters, right? If there's no place to stand outside that spectrum and say, oh, I've actually got deeper priorities than avoiding the worst possible misery for everyone, right? There's no place to stand where you can have deeper priorities than that, right? Any priority that you could that you could conceptualize must be derivative of some set of actual or possible experiences for you or others, right? So, if you're going to, again, this is when you drill down on what could possibly be implied by a phrase like the worst possible misery for everyone, right? There's no limit to how bad that could be, right? And with nothing good ever coming from it. And again, and so it is with the positive side of the spectrum. And so, morality for me is born of the fact that we live in a causal framework where there are right and wrong answers with respect to how to navigate on this framework. I mean, so all the people who think there's, there can't be any right answers to questions of right and wrong and good and evil because, cultures disagree about these things and, individuals disagree and, how would we adjudicate these disagreements, usually can be led to see that kind of doubt breaks down when you just talk about the causes that allow specific minds or groups of minds to experience different outcomes on this continuum of possible experience. So are there right and wrong answers to the question of how to move from a specific state of, individual or collective misery to something much, much better, right? And there are obviously right and wrong answers to that. There are answers at every level of causation, from subatomic particles on up, right? There are answers with respect to physics and chemistry and biology and psychology and sociology and economics. At every level where we have a fact-based discussion about human minds and societies and brains and neurotransmitters, at every level, we're talking about facts, and we're talking in terms of scientific insights and lack thereof, right? We're talking about our own ignorance, right? And things we could know that could make a difference immediately, right? So would it be good to find a vaccine for this novel coronavirus? Well, yeah, on balance, I think we all have a very strong intuition that it would be very good, and we're paying a price for not being able to do that every day this week, right? Now, how steep a price is that? Well, it's very difficult to quantify, right? So there are many things that have answers in principle, but we'll never get the answers in fact, and people get confused over that difference, right? So the fact that it can be very difficult or even impossible to figure out just, which way to go to maximize human well-being in any given moment. I mean, is it Is it better to this is one of the classic problems with consequentialism, this notion that the rightness or wrongness of any action is based on the consequences. It's you never finally get you never get a final tally of the consequences, right? So and there are kind of weird wrinkles here where something that seems objectively bad in the end could be good because it could have some unforeseen consequence that really closed the door to much greater misery. So maybe in the end we'll recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic was actually good, despite the fact that it's killed, in the U.S., already nearly 200,000 people, and produced trillions of dollars in damage. Maybe there'll be a credible argument 10 years from now that because of what a wake-up call this was, we have just, bulletproofed our pandemic response now in a way that we never would have otherwise. And now we really need it because lo and behold, there's a bird flu that's got a 60% mortality rate, and we shut it down immediately because we had prioritized a pandemic response. That's true, right? So it's true that things that seem bad may turn out to be good in the end, given certain responses and all of that. But we can factor that in. The reality is there's a lawful way to move in a direction worth going, i.e. away from the worst possible misery for everyone and towards something much better. Now, how much better? That's, I think, the horizon of possible states of human well-being is genuinely wide open and very far away, right? Like we can't even dimly make out how good human life could be. I mean, how good will human life be in 1,000,000 years if we solve all of our most pressing problems, right? It's just unimaginable.
But so does this beg the question of we can't judge anything as moral?
Well, no, we can, because again, we just need. It's like you can, even now, you can see the wisdom of taking your hand off of a hot stove, right?
Right, but that's science, though, right? So it seems like, and this is where a lot of your discussion of consciousness in the book even has sort of a line where, like, take two elements, take two atoms and put them together. It would be very bad if a chemical reaction didn't result in the normal rules of physics and the universe applying. Like if the rules of the universe that we've outlined with science don't apply in one case, that could mean something horrifically bad or it just never will happen. Whereas with consciousness, there is this opportunity that something inside of us, as you say, there's a navigation problem. Something inside of us makes us take the next step towards a more rational behavior, i.e., a better society, for instance, or better outcomes for ourselves. So, if though that's unpredictable, so that seems like the line between not consciousness, i.e., just pure scientific outcome, and okay, we have some choice. There's some universe of possibility, and since we can't say when that possibility is ended where we could judge the outcome of it, what does that say about morality and consciousness?
Well, we make incremental gains on more or less every front without ever arriving at a final resting point where we know we have the right answer for all time, right? I mean, it's a little bit analogous to engineering and doing something as simple as building a house, right? So if you're building a house today in the year 2020, you're doing it having benefited from all of the mistakes that home builders have made for really for thousands of years. But most recently, I mean, in a developed society, you'll be benefiting from engineering standards and legal requirements to meet them in a city like New York or Los Angeles, right? So it's just we will have discovered ways to keep buildings from falling down that are improvements over the old ways that we didn't understand, were mistaken for various reasons, or they're responsive to new conditions that we now understand. I mean, when you don't know about what an earthquake is, you don't engineer against it, and now discovering earthquakes and how and something of their periodicity, we factor that in. And this is why knowledge matters. It always matters, right? So if you really believe in God who can be propitiated by prayer, you might think that that's the way to engineer buildings. And that used to be the case. I mean, it used to be the case the world over, right? In literally dozens, if not hundreds of cultures, that people thought that the best way to keep a building from falling down, I mean, literally to keep a building from falling in on itself, was to perform a human sacrifice, right? I mean, and we have found, the remains of bodies buried in the foundations of buildings, and it's now understood that we had bodies buried in the post holes of buildings as a propitiation to gods who would otherwise knock these buildings down, right? That's what engineers do in the absence of any understanding of physics. They sacrifice somebody's child. And on some level, we're still doing stupid things like that. We're just getting much smarter, over the centuries. And we're closing the door to specific errors and hopefully not making those errors again. But it is iterative, and it's always just reasoning to the best explanation. It's never having a final set of truths in hand, but it's having something like a good enough set so as to keep reorienting, right? I mean, it's just like we know enough now to know that when it comes time to figure out how to build the next skyscraper, the one that's going to be 500 feet taller than anything that exists now, human sacrifice is no longer on the table to be considered as a possible remedy for our engineering problems. And so it is with many other dumb ideas, right? We close the door to them. And this is no less true on moral questions than it is on engineering questions. It's just people are slower to admit it, right? So that the Taliban really are wrong to want what they think they want, right? They really are confused. If you're a Taliban father who thinks that you'd rather have your daughter be illiterate and living in a bag and then just married off for a dowry, right? If you think that if she gets raped, the appropriate response emotionally is to feel overcome with shame, right, and anger, rather than compassion, and to want to kill her out of shame, right? And so that honor killing becomes the response to your own daughter, who you purport to love, being victimized, right? That is just a complex of moral confusion, and it's a piece of code. It's legacy code from our distant ancestors. I mean, in this case, I don't know what the first honor culture was, but it is clearly an operating system that has been improved in other cultures, right? We've gotten a firmware update, right, that these guys haven't gotten, and it's better code, right? It's more compassionate code. It's leading onward in a way that even members of the Taliban want, but they just don't see it, right? Like I don't think members of the Taliban are especially fond of infant mortality and maternal mortality, right? I mean, infant mortality and maternal mortality in Afghanistan at one point was the highest in the world. When the Taliban was really ruling things there, and let's just stipulate that even Mullah Omar is not a fan of seeing women and children die, merely by struggling to be born. But there's a direct connection between that and having the kind of society that keeps girls illiterate and living in bags, right? I mean, you can only succeed so much as a material society and as an intellectual society, keeping half your population immiserated and enslaved, right? And then spending the rest of your time learning to recite from a book of ancient pseudo knowledge. In this case, the Quran, right? I mean, it's like the whole project is so deranged, given the real opportunities for human well-being, that it is true that we can stand in relation to it exactly as critically as we can stand in relation to it with respect to morality, in the same way as we can with any other domain of knowledge. So, yes, the Taliban are not experts on physics or medicine or any other domain of real knowledge, and they're also not experts on morality, right? And when they pretend to be experts on morality, when they claim that it is their heartfelt concern that their daughters not be taught to read, right? And they're going to throw battery acid in their faces if they try to go to school, and they're going to shoot someone like Malala Yousafzai, right, in the head, hoping to kill her for going to school, and they're going to claim that the fatwa stands even after she wins the Nobel Prize, right? We can condemn this every bit as much as if somebody were promising to design a new system of rockets or satellites based on Taliban conceptions of physics.
And so I agree, and of course I think anybody with common sense would agree. But then how do you overcome the argument that what makes our society now an expert over that society, which is kind of the argument the relativists make? Like, how do we respond to that potential contradiction on our side?
Well, just look at the standards by which we would point out our own moral errors, right? So that these people, the people who would pause before judging the Taliban, are precisely the people who are most concerned about racism in our society, inequality, Me Too. I mean, these people are all hashtags all the time, right? It's all Me Too and Black Lives Matter for people who would castigate me for judging the Taliban, right? It is a performative contradiction.
I see. So it's almost like the distance in the contradiction is what tells you there might be something wrong in this style of thinking, as opposed to a consistency.
Precisely the same standard you would use to grow really animated over Me Too, right? And all of the specific incidents in which women have been abused or their lives have been made harder in our society, right? So if you're concerned about rape and sexual violence and sexual harassment and just off-color jokes and women made to feel disadvantaged in the boardroom, right? If that's really what gets you up in the morning with your moral outrage, and I'm not saying anyone's wrong to be outraged by that. I mean, I have two daughters, and their well-being is paramount in my mind. I want all their dreams realized, right? So I'm down with feminism in all its sane forms, while acknowledging that there are insane forms of it out there, especially on Twitter at the moment. But if you're concerned that women have absolute political equality in the United States, well, then that same moral concern is what should get you to recognize how profoundly unlucky one is to be born a girl in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, right? That is a absolutely dismal outcome for somebody.
Now, it's interesting because this is related to your chapter on tyranny, and I always so John Rawls is this political philosopher describing what, let's say, an ideal democracy should look like, and it includes people who are both reasonable and rational. Rational meaning that they want what's best for themselves, and that could also mean what's best for society, because if society is good, then I'm doing good. And reasonable means, hey, other people are going to have different opinions, and we need to all come together and address those opinions, and sometimes I'll win and sometimes I won't when a consensus is reached. But there's limits to it. And I think you're defining what those limits are, that basically things a system of any one person's rational belief should remain consistent. Like, it can't be, something can't be good for me, but that same thing not appropriate for you.
Yeah. So reasons, real reasons that others should take seriously need to be generalizable, right? I mean, it can't be true just because you're you and I'm me, right? It has to be true in some more global sense. I mean, it's not to say that people can't make specific claims about their own experience, but if they're just local to their own experience, well, then they're not something that others can be argued into really acting on, right? So, I mean, like a question about what is really fair or just, that can't just apply to a specific individual. That has to be that refers to some framework in which we all need to act, and we all need to see the rightness of it, right? And we will see the rightness of it provided you're actually making an argument based on something that is universalizable.
So how does this, and again, I'm going back and forth to different chapters in your book, but compare that with discussions on racism, where, in these conversations range from what is racism to what is systemic racism to racism doesn't really exist, it's classism. Like, where do you settle on that in all of your conversations on this?
Right. So this is one of those topics that is essentially like plutonium, right? I mean, it's very hard to handle it without getting damaged reputationally, especially if you're a white guy making the argument that I'm about to make, right? So that's just something to know up front, and then you can decide just how vocal you want to be with your views, right? But this is what I'm about to say now is the kind of thing that dishonest people or confused people will respond to with charges of racism, right? And I've really the only remedy for this in the current environment is to make yourself uncancelable, right? So it's like, I've taken, as I think great pains to create a platform where I can just say what I want, right? And it's because I think it's true and useful, and we need to talk about these real problems, and we need to do it honestly, and no one can fire me, right? So I can say, but it takes some effort to do that, and I recognize not everybody can, and it's a problem that what I'm about to say is the sort of thing that can get someone fired if they're an academic, even one with tenure, frankly, or certainly if you're a journalist, you can get fired. So, the first thing to concede up front is that racism is a real problem and has been. I mean, let's just speak locally in the U.S., right? Racism and certainly slavery, which was its worst instance, is really the original sin of our society, right? So I can grant all of that and go on at great length acknowledging just how bad racism has been and how we are right to go to war with it and overcome it, and there's more work to do on that front, which is to say there are people who are actual racists in our society. They're white supremacists and imbeciles who are even now, as I'm speaking these sentences, probably getting swastikas tattooed on their bodies. There are people with those kinds of convictions yet living among us. But they truly are a far fringe, right? It's not, you have to work very hard to find real racists, people who will say, yeah, I want to live in a all white society, or, I want to keep people of certain skin color or ethnic backgrounds out of this society because they're inferior. Real members of the Ku Klux Klan or people sympathetic with those ideas. It used to be that there were millions of such people in our society, and they were senators and governors, and there was a kind of ascendancy to real ideological racism which is not the case now and hasn't been for quite some time. But there are legacies of the period of slavery and Jim Crow, Reconstruction and Jim Crow, which we're still struggling to fully retire, right? So there are after effects, and speaking honestly about these after effects is really important. It's really important that we understand why the Black community in particular has some obvious disadvantages, even in the year 2020 in our society. A much higher crime rate in particular, and much less wealth, right? I mean, this is just obvious. There's obvious wealth inequality that breaks along racial lines in our society. So, I mean, class is its own variable here, but class also correlates with race in our society, and to the disadvantage of the Black community especially. It's important that we understand all of this in a good faith way and figure out what to do about it, right? And what the default situation here now is that most people on the left, more or less anywhere left of center, assume that all of the inequality that we see in our society or along racial lines is born of racism, right? So when you ask the question, why aren't there more Black, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies or Black cardiologists? Why is there, why do Black families on average have 1/10 the accumulated wealth of white families? The only acceptable answer to that is white racism or so-called systemic racism or institutional racism, which again is maintained by either white racists or white people who don't know they're racist or are so callous and uninterested in solving these problems that they're ignoring some obvious glaring errors with respect to housing policy or anything else that maintains these disadvantages. Now, at the margins, some of that is true, right? I mean, I think there are policies that I'm sure exist, and some will discover that reliably disadvantage Black people over white people, and certainly poor people over rich people. And again, that cuts mostly. That has a racial component for whatever reason. Now, and this is true in the criminal justice system. When you look at the kinds of prison sentences people serve and for what crimes, but it is an open question, a genuinely open question, how much of today's inequality in the year 2020 is born of any form of racism, and how much of it it has other causes, right? And the bias on the left is to set the racism detector at such a sensitive setting that they seem to find racists everywhere, right? And so you have books like White Fragility that are basically arguing that all white people are racist, and it's a something for which there is no real remedy. It's just like you're like once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. You just need to own it, and it needs to become the central principle of your life, that you overcome this problem. That if you can't find it in yourself, that's somehow a double symptom of it. You're in so much denial of your racism that you can't even admit it. And this is a cult, right? This anti-racist movement in the U.S. now is a genuine moral panic that has all of the signs of being a cult. There's blasphemy, there's taboos, there's scapegoating, and essentially human sacrifices.
Hate for near believers.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Detecting the slightest demurral, and someone who otherwise agrees with you about everything is, requires an auto da fe. I mean, like literally, it just heretics are being hunted. Especially on social media. And again, this is not. This sounds exaggerated, but lives are being destroyed, careers are being destroyed over this, and it is a true hysteria, right? You're not dealing with rational people when you're talking about this topic, for the most part. We see celebrities, in response to the George Floyd killing, we see celebrities, basically posting hostage videos on Twitter, talking about, tearfully talking about their own racism and culpability, right? I mean, some of the least racist people and least racist parts of culture ever to form in any society, right, are now rending themselves over their original sin. It's completely maddening. This is happening in the scientific community. We've got journals like Nature and Science publishing editorials about having to root out their own racist bias. It's like the Oscars. The Academy of Motion Pictures is focused on its racism. Every private school in every well-intentioned part of affluent America is soul searching about its racism. These are some of the least racist cultures that have ever existed on Earth, right? Objectively, right? This is not, again, I'm not saying that racism isn't still a problem in our society, and we should genuinely find it and genuinely resist it, and that's all true. But you are talking about you're talking about a society that has made immense progress since 1964, and we now have many people who are disproportionately white and well off. Right? This is not this is not the center of narrative gravity of the Black community now, but it's the center of gravity among woke white people. I mean, the irony is that wokeness is itself a sign of white privilege, largely now. Overeducated white people on the left are the most woke people in our society. They're the most animated about the problem of racism now, and they're positively aflame with it, and it's totally dysfunctional. It is engineering its own backlash. I mean, the only response right of center to this in the end will be white identity politics. And if Trump wins in November, I mean, he could be too far gone in his ineptitude around COVID to eke out a victory. But if he does win in November, it will be 100% because of this hysteria on the left, specifically over the variable of race now. And it's just an own goal of just epic proportions, completely unnecessary. We can fight racism without lying to ourselves about just how big a problem it is.
Oh my gosh, I love these clothes. Mizzen and Main. That's Mizzen and Main. It really is the most comfortable work clothes. Travel clothes. I had to travel this whole week. I'm traveling for a week and a half, and I just took Mizzen and Main clothes with me. Close out 2023 in style with comfortable, breathable, packable, and machine washable pieces from Mizzen and Main. As you wrap up your year-end goals, enjoy a Mizzen and Main dress shirt that you can wear confidently. I like that they've very, very just nice, solid colors. I don't really like to get all fancy in patterns and everything, although they do have some pattern shirts, but very comfortable clothes, stretchable pants. It's just super comfortable, but they look professional, and you can wear them casually or professionally. I like some of their flannel shirts or untuck shirts. I love untuck. I never tuck in. So again, whether you're shopping for a special someone or giving yourself the gift you really want, I just buy myself gifts Mizzen in Maine is the perfect gift for any guy who works, travels, and or cares about looking and feeling great. As you could tell by my many photos across the internet, I care about looking fantastic. I'm practically a model. And let's be honest, every guy loves to look great. So again, shop now at mizzenandmain.com and save 20% when you spend $130 or more using promo code James. That's promo code James at Mizzen and Main, Mizzen and Main.com.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
The future of learning is definitely online. Like, it's such BS that you have to spend $200,000 or take $200,000 in loans and go to some fancy school when it's useless. It doesn't guarantee you a job. Most employers, including me, do not care about degrees or grades or anything like that. We want to care that you love what you're doing, that you know what you're doing, in some cases that you have experience or that you're willing to learn. But people in general love learning and are curious. Like, the key to success is curiosity. And I think masterclass.com is the perfect model for online learning. I'm really happy they're sponsoring this episode. If you're going to give a gift, give the gift of learning. Masterclass makes a meaningful gift this season for you and anyone on your list, because both of you can learn from the best to become your best, from leadership to effective communication to cooking. Let me tell you some of the classes I've taken. I've taken comedy from Steve Martin. I mean, can you believe I can take a class from Steve Martin on comedy, or Judd Apatow, my favorite comedy director? I could take an actual class from him on writing. Wolfgang Puck on cooking. Dan Brown on writing, or Judy Bloom, who's been on this podcast, on writing. By the way, Wolfgang Puck also has been on this podcast. It's such a pleasure. I try to take classes all the time from masterclass.com. And whether you're watching Masterclass on TV or listening in audio mode in the app or on their site, the quality speaks for itself. It's like these Masterclass instructors are your own personal mentors that are going to help you reach the next level. How much would it cost to take one-on-one classes on comedy from Steve Martin or on chess from Gary Kasparov? You just wouldn't be able to do it. But it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. With a Masterclass annual membership, it's $10 a month. Memberships start at $120 a year for unlimited access to one-on-one classes with all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. So it's not just $120 for one instructor. You get all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. Boost your confidence and find practical takeaways you can apply to your life and at work. And if you own a business or are a team leader, use Masterclass to empower and create future-ready employees and leaders. That's the real education in today's world. So this holiday season, you can give one annual membership and get one free at masterclass.com/JAS. JAS, of course, stands for the James Altucher Show. So right now you can get two memberships for the price of one at masterclass.com/JAS. Masterclass.com/JAS. Offer terms apply. I want to reel back to in the very first part of the book, a lot of it is about consciousness and your interest in it and how that interest evolved. I know back when you were initially an undergrad, you dropped out of school and then went on, of course, to finish and then get a PhD. I know I'm switching topics, but I really am fascinated by this story. What inspired you initially to drop out? And then this leads, of course, into your interest in consciousness.
Yeah, well, first it was there were really two variables. One was I knew I wanted to be a writer, but at that point I thought I wanted to write novels. So, and if you're writing fiction, it doesn't really matter if you go to grad school or even finish school as long as you're writing, the great fiction. So I thought at the time, well, then I should just get busy doing that. I know what my path in life is going to be. Is I'm going to be a writer, and I just don't need more school. So that was part of it. From the career side, that was the thing that made me not see a real disadvantage in dropping out. And I knew I could go back too. So, I mean, that was the other things that I was going to Stanford, which I may be alone among decent schools that it just had a policy that you really can never drop out. You can only what they call stop out, and you can just show back up, 20 years later if you want, and re-enroll. You don't have to stay in good standing with them in any way. I think that was part of it, but also I had gotten very interested in meditation and philosophy in general, but Eastern philosophy in particular. I had a kind of quasi spiritual awakening based on my first experience with MDMA, and then linking that up with having read a few books and deciding that meditation was worth looking into. And then I started sitting meditation retreats, and I went to India and Nepal and studied with various teachers, and that took on its own momentum in my 20s. And that's really what my 20s were about. I was writing, but mostly studying meditation and giving myself an esoteric education and reading philosophy at that point. But then when I started writing nonfiction, and I very soon thereafter realized that, okay, now this stuff is no matter what its quality is, unlike fiction, this is going to be unpublishable because their first question is going to be, how do you know any of this stuff, right? I mean, where'd you go to school and what did you study? And having been an English major and then dropping out was not going to be good enough. So then I went back and finished my degree in philosophy, and then did a PhD in neuroscience. All the while knowing that what I really wanted to do was write and speak and think about the mind.
And do you think this credentialism is something that we're stuck with, or do you think we're also evolving beyond that? Like the idea that you can't do X without some sort of certification?
I don't think we're stuck with it. I think you have to be really smart and talented to not connect any of those dots and still succeed. I mean, there are people who, have become celebrated, scientists without having a PhD in science. There have been physicists who never got graduate degrees in physics. There are obviously, people who've made great contributions to computer science without formally being computer scientists or even finishing college. I think Jaron Lanier is one of those people. He's been on my podcast. Eliezer Yudkowsky who's really a brilliant guy who has made more contributions to the ethics of AI. He never went to high school, I think, or maybe he certainly didn't finish high school. But you have to be damn smart for nobody to care about any of your credentials. And even there, in certain cases, you do show some of the scars of being self-taught, I would argue. And I mean, there are advantages to being self-taught because you never learn to put on certain blinders, but there are some disadvantages. I mean, you do reinvent the wheel or give it corners on occasion because you just haven't been, you haven't had to jump through all the hoops that you have to jump through to get, through the machinery of academia in the normal sequence. And, I think, frankly, I think I show some of the scars of being self-taught, at least on certain topics. And again, it's an advantage and a disadvantage, and it's hard to know how to net it out in the end. But I think it is true that you can learn so much now on your own. And one's tempted to say you can learn everything, almost on your own now. So, if you're disciplined enough, and you're in a field where you can demonstrate competence in a way that is unfakeable, then I do think the path is open to many people to just bypass the usual curriculum altogether. And
Because look at your experience. Like you basically had this awakening experience triggered by, possibly MDMA, and then you
oh, no,
go
no,
to India, Nepal.
quite certainly MDMA.
Quite
Yeah, yeah.
certainly. So, and you go to India and Nepal, and you study with, people who are essentially the equivalent of super experts on meditation and consciousness and spirituality, perhaps. And that alone, though, you still had to kind of come back to learn the intellectual language around it before you felt comfortable writing about it. Even though you say there might be scars from your experiences of self teaching, but maybe those scars are positive.
Yeah, I mean, the positive side, and again, you can get this even if you go through all the usual channels. I just think this could be more temperamental than actually the result of the path one takes. But I think being an autodidact certainly helps on certain, at least in certain areas. You can learn to disregard or never even notice the purported boundaries between disciplines, right? Because the truth is, the boundaries between intellectual areas, topics, the boundary between neuroscience and psychology, or neuroscience and psychology and the philosophy of mind, or those three things and computer science. These boundaries are fungible or non-existent, right? They're porous at a minimum at every point, and so there's no telling when an insight into one area will be relevant in another. And for anyone who's really confined by traditional boundaries in a discipline, they're being starved of certain information, right? They're now to some degree observing those boundaries is born of just the limits in any one person's time or attention, right? I mean, it's just born of specialization. If you want to go really deep in one area, if you want to get really good, if you want to become a world expert on a certain kind of neurotransmitter, well, then you're going to spend a lot of time focused on that topic to the exclusion of everything else, and that's just what it is to specialize. But viewed from another side, the boundaries between specific disciplines really are just the result of university architecture and university budgets, and they say nothing about the nature of reality, and you should ignore them, right? And you should be free as a neuroscientist or as a philosopher or as an economist to become interested enough in adjacent or even distant disciplines so as to make a contribution there, right? I mean, that's possible, right? And you should also just there's room to be an intelligent generalist who's if not a true polymath, someone who's interested in so many things that you're just bouncing all over the place, finding connections. I mean, all of that is incredibly useful, and so that's the mode I tend to be in, and it's the mode one can readily be in if one hasn't been, doesn't have the sunk cost of having spent 20 years being increasingly narrow in one specialization, such that when it comes time to think or say anything of substance about another domain, one's first impulse is to to assume that you really can't or shouldn't, right? Like I'm the world expert on serotonin and specific receptor sites, and I wouldn't want an economist telling me about that. So I'm not gonna presume to know much of anything about the economy. That kind of scientific humility is very valuable in certain cases, but it's a kind of intellectual anorexia in other cases, and it's what we need more and more are smart people who can function by very specific norms of intellectual honesty, who can get up to speed on many different fronts and fertilize various disciplines by making adjacent or even distant connections between them, because it's not an accident that you often see people come in from you see a physicist come into biology and make breakthrough contributions, or vice versa, and it's worth disregarding those boundaries, and people who have more of a self-taught path do that readily because they're just they were never taught to do otherwise.
And when you went back to school and learned, and you got your PhD and you have this much more rigorous study of the theories behind consciousness, do you think that added to your knowledge, compared with what you learned from meditation and what you learned in India and Nepal and so on?
Oh yeah, it was a very different kind of language game to be playing, and it wasn't so relevant to consciousness per se, because the truth is we still don't know much of anything about consciousness in neuroscience, but we know a lot about the mind, and a lot about its dependency on the brain, and a lot about the brain in general, and that was the domain of facts I wanted to know something about, so as to constrain the conversation about the mind. I mean, if you're talking about the human mind and you don't know anything about the brain, you're just, at some level, you're not actually talking about the mind anymore, right? You're fantasizing about it, right? If you're going to be a Freudian, in principle, or a Jungian, or any other, devoted to any other school of mind talk, and never make contact with what we're learning about the brain, well, then you've tied both hands behind your back intellectually.
Well, I guess a big question is, in terms of the relationship between neuroscience and experiences you might get through meditation, is how much of it is, and I'm asking this with not having knowledge in it, how much of it is neurochemical versus something that some higher consciousness or some deeper consciousness that one touches through meditation?
Well, I mean, this is something I get into mostly in my book, Waking Up, and in a deeper and more ongoing way in my app by that same title. I think it's not that discussion about the brain will ever fully supersede our discussion about the mind. It's not like we will one day cease to talk about things like thoughts and feelings, or states of mind like love and compassion, and only talk about neurotransmitters and their reuptake, right? I mean, it's like these are two different language games that each have their sphere of application. But it just is true that we know more and more about the fact that our experience, the material basis for our experience, is what is happening in our heads. The mind is what the brain is doing. Now, the truth is, consciousness is its own kind of outlier topic, that is distinct. We don't know how consciousness arises in physical systems. You're certainly you'll never embarrass yourself at a cocktail party among neuroscientists or any other scientists if you suppose that consciousness arises at some level of information processing in a complex system like the brain. I mean, that is the most well-subscribed view in science at this point, which is to say that most scientists are physicalists, and they believe that everything, including consciousness, is at bottom a physical process. But what that actually means really is still hard to specify, and whether that ever will admit of a proper reduction of consciousness to the physics of things is still an open question. I mean, I think it's, consciousness, it just seems hard. I mean, this is why it's called the hard problem of consciousness. And this is at least 2 chapters on this topic in the book. Consciousness is not like another phenomenon where the understanding its micro constituents provides a genuine explanation, right? Like if I'm going to talk about something like the fluidity of water or the brittleness of glass, right, or the way some heat appears at the macroscopic level of a human hand, to talk about what molecules and atoms are doing actually does explain the macro level phenomenon. The micro phenomenon explain the macro phenomenon in a way which conserves our intuitions. And so it is with a phenomenon as complex as life, right? When you actually get into the details of what differentiates a living system from a dead one, our intuitions begin to get cashed out, which is to say that the explanations do not look like miracles. They're very complex, right? I mean, to talk about the molecular biology that gives us wound repair or inheritance, just the reproduction of species, right? DNA and protein synthesis and all of the mechanics here are complex, but at no point do you say, oh, that's just a miracle, right? That requires a miracle. That's fundamentally it's a transition that cannot be cashed out intuitively, right? That it makes no sense, where it's like it's getting a rabbit is being pulled out of the hat. You're getting something out of truly nothing. That doesn't happen when you're trying to explain life. It seems to happen when you're trying to explain consciousness in terms of states that are unconscious in and of themselves, which is to say that, let's just say that it's true that a single neuron is unconscious. There's nothing that is like to be said neuron. But if you wire it together with, a specific number of other neurons in a certain configuration, well, then the lights come on, right? Then there's something that is like to be that system. It has a point of view. It has a felt point of view. It's not that it merely can process information, but it feels like something to process that information. It has a qualitative character to its experience. It's not just that it's functionally integrated with other streams of causes in the world, but it's like something to be functionally integrated in precisely that way. That's the mystery of consciousness. When you actually look at what's being claimed there, I would claim that it is still a miracle. It still sounds like a miracle. It's still something that is a brute fact that isn't being successfully understood. It's just being stated. It's like, the only analogy in science is the notion that everything, the universe, its laws, everything came out of nothing, right? Like first there was nothing, and then there was the Big Bang or some initiating event which came out of nothing. Right now, that may in fact be true, but to state it as such isn't to understand it. That isn't actually an explanation. That's simply a brute fact, which we need to merely accept. It's not to say it's not true. It's just it's not parsable. It's not explanatory. We don't understand it. If anything sounds like a miracle, that does. And this transition from nothing that it's like to be a physical system subjectively, that is, unconsciousness, to consciousness, it seems to me to be the subjective equivalent of that. It does seem like the restatement of a miracle.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the analogy, because, in terms of the beginning of the universe, whether it's the Big Bang or something else, or we're a simulation, that's one of those cases where we don't know the answer, but most likely there is an answer, whereas there might not be an answer to the relationship between consciousness and reality, other than to say it's a miracle.
Well, there could be an answer. It seems like it's very difficult to imagine. I mean, thus far, in my view, it has been impossible to imagine what the answer could be such that it would be understandable, right? So normally when there's a blank space on the map of our understanding, we can imagine what could be in that space so as to complete the puzzle in a way that would be intelligible to us. I mean, the universe being a simulation is just that sort of thing, right? I mean, it's not to say that it's the most rational thing to believe, but we could imagine what could be true such that that would be the case and would be explanatory, right? And so it is with all manner of spooky thing. I mean, let's just say that it's true that we have immortal souls that are merely integrated with our physical bodies, and then after death they go off to paradise or to hell, depending on what was believed about the origin of a specific book. I mean, it's a preposterous set of ideas. There's no evidence for it, and the fact that half of humanity at least believes something like that is no evidence in support of it. But it's the kind of thing that you could sort of fit into the space provided, right? You could say, okay, well, let's talk about this. I mean, there's some problems at the margins, like how does this soul that is immaterial, which is to say it's immortal, it can float free of the brain at death. Well, how does it influence human thought and behavior during life? I mean, if it's immaterial, how is it having this billiard ball effect on the clockwork of things? How is it pushing around neurotransmitters? I mean, they're clearly having their effect. At the synapse. We can't deny that because we know too much about how brains work at this point. So where's the room for the soul to do its work? Well, there could be some kind of bridging principle. We can sort of drill down on what we would imagine there. Now, again, I don't believe anything like this. These ideas are have a marginal and scarcely existent stature in science at this point, and for good reason. But again, it's not the kind of thing that is impossible to imagine. What the shape of the thing that would need to be true for it to be true. But when you're talking about consciousness emerging from unconscious complexity, right? So it's just a fact that there's nothing that it's like to be a human brain in one state, but you put it in a slightly different state, the single neuron that is the difference that makes the difference. Well, then all of a sudden it has a rich perspectival experience of the sort that you're having right now. Again, that may be true. It's like that we could find the answer at the back of the book of nature, which just states the fact that neurons have to be firing at precisely 41 hertz, within a window of 500 milliseconds. And if you get to 39 hertz, at 600 milliseconds, well, the lights go out, right? But again, that is every bit as bizarre and seemingly miraculous as making any other kind of claim about a complex system. Like, what if it's just true that if you have a rainstorm that has a certain wind velocity, well, then that whole system of clouds becomes conscious, right? That would be insane if that were true. I mean, that would be the statement of a miracle. And we're in that territory when we're trying to posit answers to the hard problem of consciousness. Any answer we posit isn't explanatory. It just seems like a brute fact, which we would have to accept.
Yeah, and I think, look, these are the types of issues, whether it's consciousness or figuring out morality or figuring out, as you title it, the road to tyranny, or dealing with, talking about cognitive biases with Daniel Kahneman. This type of thinking is what makes the book Making Sense so special. And I feel like we've only hit the tip of the iceberg of the book, and the book itself hits the tip of the iceberg of, your hundreds of interviews on the Making Sense podcast, which I'm an avid listener to. And so, once again, Sam Harris, author of Making Sense, I'm so happy you made the time to come on the podcast to talk about the book. I have one remaining question, which is, and by the way, thank you for the advice early on in the podcast. And the one remaining question is, I feel so calm when I talk to you. You're like such a calming voice. Do you ever get upset at things? I can't imagine you being like angry and yelling at somebody.
Yeah, no, I definitely get upset. I just, for me, the real benefits of meditation in this area is thus far is not that it has, perfectly barred the door to any specific negative emotion. It's just that the half-life of these emotions is greatly reduced. I mean, I can more or less get off the ride any moment I want. So if I'm suddenly provoked to anger by something, I see, I'm sure if I saw Jerry Seinfeld attacking me in the New York Times, I'd have a big reaction. But then very, very quickly, my mind would go into the mode of thinking, okay, how useful is this? Right? Like what is there something to do on the basis of this reaction? And is it best done under the shadow of this emotion? Right? Like if you want to be effective, if you want to, so let's say I do need to write a response, right? Well, then this anger signal or this despair signal or whatever the negative emotion is, it's a salience signal, right? It's like, okay, this is worth paying attention to. You just had a famous person say something bad about you. What should you do next? Well, you can use it as energy, right? But very likely what you do next is not best done in a state of real anger, right? It's like rage is almost never helpful, apart from just this initial orienting response of paying attention to the problem. It's good to be able to let go of negative emotion very quickly, and again, that's what mindfulness allows you to do, right? Because if you get out of your thoughts about why you feel this way and have every right to feel this way and all the bad things that have just happened or will happen, and if you notice thoughts as mere appearances in consciousness, and you notice the physiology of the emotion that has been kindled by your brooding for minutes about what just happened, you become interested in these appearances. Again, there's just language in the mind and imagery in the mind and physiological changes in your body that have no intrinsic meaning, right? I mean, this feeling of anger, the moment you recognize the physiology of it, it no longer has psychological content, right? The thoughts are just images and language in the mind, and the anger is just this, warmth in your chest and tightness in your face, and it's just pure sensation. And the moment you become interested and inquisitive and accepting of it, and just nakedly aware of it, i.e., mindful of it, it begins to dissipate very, very quickly. I mean, the half-life of any emotion like anger is on the order of seconds. Now, it's not even minutes, right? So it's impossible to stay angry unless you get lost in thought again about all the reasons why you should be angry. And the more you train your mind to notice that process, the more you're free to just relax, even when there's something left to do. I mean, even when you then have to block out, the rest of your day just to write a response to the article that defamed you or whatever it was. It's you can find balance more and more quickly, and that really is the kind of superpower you get when you practice enough meditation. It's not a matter of never feeling angry ever again, or fearful ever again, or sad ever again. I mean, that perhaps there's some state to be realized where that is in fact possible, but I certainly haven't gotten there myself, and I'm not even sure it makes sense to want that. Again, I think you do want these signals of salience, right? I mean, fear is very useful, anger is very useful in specific contexts, but you just don't want to stay there for very long, and that's mindfulness gives you that ability to just break the spell.
That's a really good point about reducing the half-life of an emotion, kind of by taking a step back and analyzing it and observing it as separate from you. And is this useful for me in the context of moving forward? I think that's a really great insight about meditation.
Yeah. And it goes deeper than that. But in terms of like the near term gains of the practice, that can come very early. I mean, people can very quickly get the ability to just pull the brakes or step off the ride, even for moments at a time. So you can just be punctuating this normal reaction with these moments of real calm, and then you get sucked back in again. But again, you can become more and more sensitive to the mechanics of that, and less taken in by them. And it's quite freeing. It's really wonderful.
I think that's why often meditation's called a practice. Like people will say, what's your practice? Meaning what style of meditation? But the word practice is really interesting because it's not about gaining enlightenment in that 30 minutes or hour or however long you meditate. It's about practice for the other 23 hours of the day.
Yeah, and it's definitely not about becoming a good meditator in the end. I mean, it's not about achieving calm in this a temporary state of calm in a formal session of meditation. I mean, even if you're spending 2 hours a day meditating, right? It's there's still most of your life is still elsewhere, right? And so the real goal is to eradicate this apparent boundary between formal practice and the rest of your life, such that you can recognize that the clarity you have in your clearest moments in so-called meditation is a property of consciousness that can be recognized in any other moment. And it's ultimately not about achieving any specific state of mental pleasure or calm, because all of those are vulnerable to the next moment. I mean, it's all temporary. I mean, every state you're going to achieve is temporary. What you want to do is recognize something about the nature of consciousness itself that is always there. And one of the things that's always there is this truth about, the impermanence of thoughts and emotions when recognized. I mean, they just arise and vanish, and they have a dreamlike quality which when you're taken in by the dream, when you're asleep and dreaming and you don't know you're asleep and dreaming. You're safely in your bed, but you think you're being, held hostage by narco traffickers, right? And you're in some emergency, right? Like you're psychotic. You're actually psychotic when you're dreaming. You're just prevented from acting out the consequences of your psychosis because you're paralyzed during REM sleep. Happily so, or at least most people who don't have various sleep disorders. And when you're lost in thought in the waking state, you're a little bit psychotic. You're a little bit like your dreaming self, right? You're confused about your circumstance. You don't know which end is up in those moments. You're having a conversation with somebody who isn't even there, right? You're talking to yourself and you're not using your mouth, right? So you don't look like a lunatic who's talking to himself out loud on the sidewalk, but you're the lunatic who just knows to keep his mouth shut, right? And meditation is the only way to break that spell. It's the only way to actually recognize what's happening in each moment. In fact, it's not even a something. It's not meditation. It is a practice, certainly, and seems like that in the beginning, but ultimately, it's not even something you're doing. It's something you're ceasing to do. You're doing less of something rather than more of something. You're at least if you're practicing this kind of awareness practice of, born of mindfulness, you're not adding anything strategically to your experience. You're ceasing to be distracted in the ordinary ways. And it's that non-distraction that is your actual refuge. And so it's sort of seeing more of what is always already happening. Thoughts are arising on their own. You can't know what's going to arise next. And so it is with sensations and perceptions. And it's just this flow of experience. And you can either recognize it in each moment, or you can be in some other state, which is analogous to a dream state, right? You can be thinking without knowing that you're thinking. And then, a pure hostage of whatever the consequences of those thoughts are. If you're thinking thoughts about, that are producing, self-doubt or anxiety or sadness or depression, so much of the time we're telling ourselves a story that is an unhappy one, and not noticing it. We're not noticing the automaticity here. And so to notice it is, in that moment, to truly notice it, right? And again, there's some subtlety here as to what is, really clearly noticing and what is just more thinking about, in this case, thinking. But to really notice it in a non-conceptual way that makes you available to the nature of your mind prior to being lost in thought is to be free of the problem. If only for a moment. And that's, again, it's something I go into in a much deeper way in Waking Up, the app. But it's incredibly useful and interesting to explore.
Well, yeah, and we've it was several years ago, but when Waking Up came out, the book, and then the app, we had a good conversation about this. And once again, Sam Harris, author of Making Sense, so many interesting insights. I feel like I could explore these issues for the rest of my life. Actually, I'm gonna have to go back to school and get a PhD now.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
But thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I reached out just the other day, and you came on in short notice. It's such a fascinating book. I hope people get it and listen to your podcast and read your other books and download the app and everything. And thanks once again.
Yeah, thanks, James. I look forward to doing it in person once civilization reboots. So see you on the other side.
Yes, definitely.
Did Did you know that franchise owners are more likely to start a successful business than entrepreneurs who go it alone? Neighborly offers 19 premier brands with services that repair, maintain, and enhance homes. With Neighborly, you'll get the business model, marketing resources, and corporate support you need to pursue a rewarding future. Learn more about joining over 5,000 Neighborly franchises by downloading your free guide at go.nbly.com/podcast.